The smell hit me before I even opened the door. It wasn't just smoke. It was that unmistakable acrid stench of burning plastic and scorched electronics, the kind that burrows into your nostrils and clings to your clothes. I froze, keys still in hand, the metal still warm from the ignition. My body was aching after a punishing 24-hour shift as sheriff of Harrison County, and all I wanted, my only thought, was to hug my daughter and collapse into bed. That fragile fantasy shattered the moment I stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that signals something is very, very wrong. And then I saw her, Sophie. She sat on the edge of the living room couch, her small, fragile frame slumped sideways, twisted in discomfort, her back unsupported, her knees drawn up awkwardly like she was trying to hold herself together. Her eyes were red and swollen, tears drying unevenly on blotchy cheeks. She wasn't crying anymore, but I could see the effort it took not to start again. She looked up at me, trying to be brave. She'd always been that, brave. Braver than any 12-year-old should ever have to be, especially one born with spina bifida. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thin and cracked. "Mrs. Davidson from the HOA." She took my chair. I blinked, confused. She said it shouldn't be visible from the street. I was doing homework by the window, and she just rolled it off the porch. I tried to stop her. She said it was being moved to community storage. But then, her breath hitched. She knocked it into her fire pit. I didn't move. Couldn't. My chest tightened as I turned slowly toward the front window. What I saw on the lawn made my heart sink like a stone in my stomach. A mangled, blackened frame, charred wheels, the melted remains of what used to be Sophie's $25,000 custom-built wheelchair, twisted and useless. That chair had given her freedom. It was the difference between living and merely surviving. Between a full school day and collapsed exhaustion. Between independence and helplessness. I forced myself to look away and knelt down in front of her. "Did she say why?" I asked, my voice even but cold. She nodded, swallowing hard. She said it was an eyesore. Said the HOA would be holding an emergency meeting to discuss unsightly medical equipment. Her lips trembled. "Dad, how am I going to get to school tomorrow? Or physical therapy?" I looked at her, trying not to show what I felt. Rage like ice was creeping into my bones. My little girl wasn't just upset, she was trapped. Without that chair, she couldn't even sit properly, let alone move through her day. The manual backup chair we kept in the garage wasn't enough. Not for more than an hour. Not with her needs. This wasn't just vandalism. This wasn't just negligence. It was something far uglier. A calculated cruelty disguised as policy. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Not for me. For her. And then, very quietly, I asked the only question that mattered. "Where is she now?" Meadowbrook Estates had seemed perfect when we first moved in. A safe, beautiful neighborhood with top-tier schools and quiet tree-lined streets. It was supposed to be our fresh start. After Marie, my wife, Sophie's mother, passed from breast cancer 3 years ago, I was left balancing single parenthood with a career in law enforcement. I thought this place would make that easier. It was close to the sheriff's office and Sophie's specialists in Minneapolis. The real estate agent had assured us that the HOA was flexible and family-friendly. I believed her. Foolishly. From the very first week, Wendy Davidson, the self-appointed Queen of Meadowbrook, made it clear we were not welcome. When the moving truck delivered Sophie's hospital-style bed, Wendy was on our porch with a highlighter-marked copy of the HOA rules, pointing to a clause about medical equipment visible from the street. When I installed a wheelchair ramp, necessary for my daughter to get in and out of our home, I received a violation notice before the concrete had even cured. The lift system on our van. Commercial equipment, not appropriate for residential zones. Every single accommodation, every adjustment Sophie needed to simply live with dignity, was met with resistance, fines, and thinly veiled disdain. Still, I played by the book, filed for ADA exemptions, submitted all the paperwork, attended meetings, gave polite explanations. I thought logic would win. I thought fairness would prevail. But it never was about logic. Wendy's problem wasn't with paperwork. It was with people like my daughter, people who didn't fit into her pristine little picture of what a neighborhood should look like. I could take her slaps on the wrist, her bureaucratic bullying. But this was different. She hadn't just crossed the line. She had lit it on fire. That night, while Sophie slept, her body curled awkwardly, supported by pillows in the ways her chair normally would, I sat in the dark living room staring out at the wreckage on our lawn. My mind was no longer swirling. It was focused. I'd seen this kind of thing before, not in neighborhoods, but in war zones. It was the same twisted logic. Dehumanize, erase, pretend the uncomfortable doesn't exist. Wendy Davidson had waged war on the vulnerable, and she'd picked the wrong target. I wasn't just a grieving father. I was Captain Grant Blackwood, 15 years in law enforcement, 4 in the Marine Corps as a military police officer. I'd dismantled cartels and cracked corruption rings. I knew how to handle someone like Wendy. But first, I needed to understand just how deep this went. This wasn't about one destroyed wheelchair. It was about a pattern. By morning, I was already working the phones. Not just to replace the chair, which would take time, months even, but to trace the damage back to its source. I reached out to Sophie's doctor to document the necessity of her equipment. I called our insurance to start the process, and then I called Maria Gonzalez, the civil rights attorney, who had helped us get Sophie the school accommodations she needed years ago. I told her what happened. She didn't hesitate. "We have a case," she said, "and we're going to build it brick by brick." While Sophie ate breakfast, struggling to balance in the too small manual chair, my brain was already moving through timelines, precedent, policy violations. I started looking at other families who had quietly moved out of Meadowbrook over the last year. I remembered the Ramirezes, who left after repeated complaints about their daughter's generator noise. The Petersons, whose mobility scooter kept earning them fines until they gave up and moved to assisted living. The Thompsons, whose request to build a sensory garden for their autistic son was denied on grounds of community aesthetics. The more I looked, the more I realized Sophie wasn't the first, but she was going to be the last. Thursday evening arrived with a heaviness that settled in my chest like a stone. I didn't want Sophie to attend the HOA meeting. She was still recovering, not just physically, but emotionally, from the trauma of what had happened. But she was adamant. Her voice, though soft, carried the kind of resolve I'd only ever seen before in her mother. "Dad," she said, looking up at me with those clear, fierce eyes. "This happened to me. I should be the one to speak." I couldn't argue with that. So we arrived at the Meadowbrook Community Center together. Sophie sat in the borrowed manual wheelchair, her posture strained and uncomfortable without the custom supports she was used to. I walked beside her, not in plain clothes this time, but in full sheriff's uniform. It wasn't a show of force. It was a message. A message that I was not only Sophie's father, but a public servant who had sworn to uphold the law and protect the vulnerable. And that message echoed through the packed room before we even spoke a word. The community center buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Word had spread, some through social media, some through whispered conversations over backyard fences. Everyone had heard about the incident, though the details varied depending on who was telling it. Some came angry, demanding accountability. Others came fearful, worried about what legal exposure the HOA might face. But all of them came. Every seat was filled. Wendy Davidson sat at the front of the room like a queen presiding over a kingdom she thought she still controlled, flanked by her ever-loyal board members. She wore a sleek blazer and a flawless blonde bob, the same smirk of authority she always carried. But when she saw us walk in, Sophie in that inadequate wheelchair, me in uniform, her eyes flickered with something she hadn't shown before: uncertainty. The meeting began with Wendy's polished, controlled voice echoing off the walls. "We've called this emergency meeting to address concerns regarding the visibility of medical equipment and other personal items in common spaces," she announced, her tone clinical, detached, as if she were discussing landscaping preferences rather than what she had done to a disabled child. "Meadowbrook Estates takes great pride in maintaining a cohesive aesthetic," she continued, outlining a series of proposed regulations, more restrictive than anything previously in place. Terms like visual uniformity, architectural cohesion, and disruption of sightlines floated in the air like perfume designed to mask something rotten. She never mentioned Sophie, not once, but her meaning was clear. She wanted to eliminate anything and anyone that challenged her pristine vision of suburban perfection. When she finally opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if debating whether to call on me at all, but under the weight of 100 stares, she gave a reluctant nod. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Captain Blackwood," I corrected her smoothly. "Sheriff's Department." That got the room's attention. A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, connecting dots they hadn't before. I let the silence grow for just a moment before speaking. 6 days ago, Mrs. Davidson removed my disabled daughter's custom wheelchair from our porch. She did so without permission. She claimed it was in violation of community aesthetics. That act resulted in the destruction of a $25,000 mobility device, and with it, the independence of a child who has done nothing wrong. There was an audible reaction. Gasps, murmurs, even some shocked glances cast in Wendy's direction. Wendy quickly stood, her voice rising. "That is a complete mischaracterization. I was removing abandoned property from a visible area, as is my responsibility. The damage was a tragic accident." But the damage had already been done, and not just to the chair. The community was listening now, and they were no longer buying the polished veneer she wore like armor. Then Sophie spoke, quietly at first, but with remarkable clarity. "That wheelchair was made just for me," she said. "Without it, I can't sit in class without hurting. I can't participate in science club. I can't even use the bathroom without help." She looked directly at Wendy, and her voice didn't waver. "Why would you take something I need just to live? What did I ever do to you?" You could have heard a pin drop. There was no community regulation strong enough to wash away the shame that question dropped on Wendy's shoulders. What followed next changed everything. I presented the full scope of what I had uncovered. A timeline of families forced to leave, a pattern of discrimination masked as policy enforcement, and most damning of all, financial records that painted a very different picture of Wendy Davidson's motivations. Properties sold under duress had been quietly purchased by Evergreen Development Group, a company closely tied to Wendy's husband. The shell company they used? WD Investments. HOA funds, more than $150,000, had been funneled into contracts with companies owned by Evergreen at inflated rates. Even Wendy's most loyal supporters began to look at her with a different kind of scrutiny, one reserved for people who say one thing and do another. A few tried to defend her, but it was weak, and when Treasurer Jennifer Miller finally stood up, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and resolve, it felt like the tide breaking. "As HOA Treasurer, I move for an immediate suspension of Mrs. Davidson from her position pending investigation of these allegations," I also move for a full audit of all HOA finances and contract records. An elderly gentleman in the back quickly seconded the motion. The vote was swift and decisive. Within minutes, Wendy was stripped of her title and escorted out, muttering threats of lawsuits that no one paid attention to anymore. Her power had evaporated. The transformation that followed in the weeks ahead was nothing short of remarkable. The new interim board, led by Jennifer Miller and Dr. Howard, moved fast. Every policy that once punished people like Sophie was re-evaluated. The ban on visible medical equipment was repealed. New guidelines were implemented that not only welcomed accessibility accommodations, but actively encouraged them. The community centre itself was renovated to exceed ADA standards. Spaces that once excluded were redesigned to include. Sophie, newly emboldened, approached the board with an idea, an adaptive technology club for kids like her. Not only was it approved, but it was funded using the same enhancement budget that Wendy had once misused. What started with 4 kids quickly grew to 15, then more, as word spread throughout the county. Meanwhile, the legal fallout for Wendy was swift and public. Criminal charges were filed for property damage and civil rights violations. The financial audit revealed a web of self-dealing and fraud that stretched back 5 years. Multiple families received settlements for the harassment they'd endured, and though no dollar amount could undo the emotional scars, the vindication gave them something they hadn't had before: justice. As for Sophie's civil case, handled masterfully by Maria Gonzalez, it resulted in a settlement that allowed us to purchase a cutting-edge wheelchair, one that offered Sophie more independence than ever before. A wheelchair with smart posture correction, terrain-adaptive wheels, and features Marie never could have imagined when she and I first held Sophie in that NICU ward years ago. Half a year later, Meadowbrook was nearly unrecognizable. Not because of new paint or landscaping, but because of something deeper. It had become a place where families with disabilities felt seen, felt safe. The community hosted its first ever inclusive festival that summer, complete with sensory tents, wheelchair-accessible games, and ASL interpreters. Sophie, glowing with quiet pride, gave a demo of her new chair to a group of curious kids, explaining the science behind the balance mechanisms and smart tilt sensors. I watched her, my heart full, remembering the fear in her eyes the night her old chair burned. Now, she was leading, teaching, thriving. That evening, as fireflies blinked in the twilight and the hum of distant laughter filled the air, Sophie sat beside me on our back patio and asked a question I hadn't expected. "Dad, do you think it was worth it? I mean, if she hadn't burned my chair, would any of this have happened?" I looked at her, considering her words carefully. "I don't think bad things happen for a reason, Sophie," I said gently. "But I do believe that when something terrible happens, we get to decide what we do next. You didn't just fight for your right to have a wheelchair. You made space for a lot of people to be seen." She nodded thoughtfully, the kind of nod that says you understand something on more than just an intellectual level. "Mom used to say that you have to shine a light on darkness to make it go away." I smiled, remembering Marie, her fierce advocacy, her belief in truth, even when it was inconvenient. She was right. One voice speaking truth can give others the courage to do the same. Sophie leaned her head against my shoulder, and for the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Meadowbrook had changed, not just in policy, but in spirit. The place where Wendy's fire pit once stood, the place where Sophie's first wheelchair was destroyed, had been converted into a community garden with raised beds accessible to everyone. And every time I saw someone in a wheelchair tending to those plants, or heard a laugh from a child once forced into the shadows, I was reminded of something deeper than justice. I was reminded of resilience, of dignity, and of a little girl who refused to be invisible.